the Hudson Library and Historical Society's Adult Program Series presents an inspiring story of inner strength and determination with Ed Lucas, author and Major League broadcaster, and Ed's son and co-author Christopher Lucas, speaking about their new book, Seeing Home, the Ed Lucas Story, a blind broadcaster's story of overcoming life's greatest obstacles. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on July 15, 2015.
My name is Gwendolyn Mayer, and I am the archivist here at the Hudson Library and Historical Society. Thank you all for coming. You will all hopefully have registered when you came here, and there was a special request among the registrations, and it is my honor to honor that request. Now this means that we have to sing, and we all have to sing. And I've actually got a volunteer to lead us as we sing Take Me Out to the Ball Field. Mr. Youngworth.
Ball game.
Ball game. Forgive me. Well, I know the song.
They want to stand up. Everybody ready? Let's see if the camera's ready.
Ready?
A one, a two.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. I don't care if I ever get back, but let's root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game.
The reason I said Giant is because our honored guest is a lifelong Giant baseball fan. Good. Thank you.
And speaking of guests, you have all come out this evening to meet the wonderful Lucas gentleman. Mr. Lucas, Mr. Christopher Lucas is here with his father, Mr. Ed Lucas, and they are our program this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the Lucas gentleman.
Okay. Go ahead. Okay. Now I'll put you as a chair right here. There you are. Just give me a moment.
Welcome. Just to clarify, he's the father, I'm the son. Thank you all for coming out. What a wonderful turnout tonight. We're honored to be here. We came all the way from New Jersey to be here with you to share my dad's story. I know, you want to hear from him. It's like trying to get John, Paul, and George, and you get Ringo up here talking instead. So. Or like you want a Mickey Mantle, you got Mickey Mouse. So I'm going to sort of moderate. We'll go back and forth between the two of us, and we're going to bring you through my father's story. Some of you have read the book. Some of you are just getting the book tonight. We're very proud to bring this story to folks. We were just at the Hall of Fame 2 weeks ago, and somebody asked, why tell the story now? Why is the book out now? Why not years ago? Why not wait a little bit? And it's because, you know, in these times today, we need stories like this, hopeful stories. I'm a little biased because he's my dad, but it's a story that we say for everyone out there. It doesn't matter who you are. You know, if I said right now, what is my father's limitation? What's his this? Well, it's pretty obvious. You would look and say, well, that's a blind man. We saw him coming in the room. He was being escorted. It's easy to see. But for some people, it's not easy to see. Every single person in the world has some sort of limitation, some sort of challenge they're facing, and it's not always on the surface. So I guarantee each and every one of you, it can be financial, it can be psychological, familial, it can be anything that you're facing that's a challenge to you, whether or not it's now, it might be in the future, in the past. We've all had some obstacle to climb in our lives, and I do this all the time. Whenever I feel like there's a moment where I want to have a little pity party and say to myself, oh, you can't do, I just look at my dad and I say, well, if he can do all that he's done, what we're going to go through while we're here tonight, all the amazing things, not just the baseball stuff, which is a lot of fun, and the backdrop of his story is baseball, but he's my hero, obviously. It's just, He's done more things than people can imagine, that most ordinary people would have been knocked to the ground and stayed there. He's gotten up off the mat so many different times, and that's why we brought the story now, because again, it's a story that his story is your story. It's everyone's story. So it's not just baseball, and if you're here for baseball, that's great, but we'll share a lot of other stories as well, but we'll start with baseball. The first thing I have to tell you before I throw it to my dad is that he was not always blind. He was born with sight. He was born prematurely, so there were vision problems. And my grandmother, we were just discussing this, actually was very, very careful, as most parents would be, as most moms would be. She wanted to make sure that my father didn't do anything that was his vision was very fragile, and that he wouldn't do anything to harm that fragile vision. And that worked great until October 3rd, 1951. So I'll turn it over to my dad. He'll pick up the story from there.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. We really appreciate it. On October the 3rd, 1951, I was in the living room with my father watching the Giants play the Dodgers in the third game of the playoff, and we're rooting for the Giants. We rooted for the Giants in the family because their farm team was in Jersey City. So we knew a lot of the players that came up from the farm team to the Giants, and being 12 years old, I was influenced by my parents, and so we were watching the game on a 12-inch TV. That was a big TV at that time. And it was the first televised game from coast to coast. Never before was there a game televised from coast to coast, except this was the first one. And the Giants were losing 4-2 at the bottom of the ninth. Thompson got up with 2 men on. In the second pitch, he hit into the left field seats to win the pennant. Well, we went crazy in the house, my father and I. My mother was working. She's a professional boxer. She boxed oranges, apples, and potatoes for the A&P. But he was so excited that the Giants won. He ran he was getting supper ready and grabbed all the dishes out of the closet to put on the table. He was so excited, yelling out the window, "The Giants won!" And he dropped all the dishes. And of course, they all broke. In the meantime, I said, "I'm getting out of here." I said, "Dad, I'm taking my baseball glove. I'm going out and play some ball." So I was a 12-year-old. We went out. We got a couple of kids together playing ball, and I was a left-handed pitcher. Took my glasses off. I always felt that I could see better without them. And I threw a pitch, and the line drive came back and boom, hit me between the eyes. And that was the last thing I ever saw.
As you can imagine, I was 12 years old. Anybody at any age facing something like that would be depressed, would be thinking their life was over. But at 12 years old, it's even more of a challenge, especially as my father says in the book, and it's actually the name of his corporation now. He always pictured, growing up near the New York City area, he would go over to New York, and a blind person to him back then in the 1950s was somebody standing on the corner with a cup and a cane, looking for a handout, and that's all he had in his mind. And people told him, loved ones, family members said, "Well, sorry, Ed, that's your life. Maybe go get a job in a newsstand somewhere or do something else, but you're never going to be able to do anything in baseball. You're never going to be able to reach." And they didn't mean it to be mean. It was just at the time, 1951, nobody ever thought about it. We're thinking, today we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there's so many different things that it's not unusual to go to a ballpark or any place in the United States and find people with disabilities productive, working, living great lives. But back then, it seemed almost impossible. So as I said, at 12 years old, you can imagine the depression. You can imagine all that came with it. But my grandmother, God bless her, like I said, she always looked out for him. She had this terrific habit of writing letters. She was an amazing letter writer. And she decided, since my father loved baseball, the best way to remedy it was to write to some of the great players of the time, people that he loved, his favorite players, and just ask them for an autograph or a baseball or something like that. And an amazing thing happened in turn. They not only wrote back to him, they invited him over to the ballpark to be their guest, not just as some sort of token kid, but to actually be with them in the clubhouse and the dugout to learn the game firsthand from them. But the best story out of all of it, didn't come from a letter. I see we have some young folks. Anybody here really big baseball fans, young folks out there? Or anyone. Who's your favorite baseball player of all today? Nick Swisher, very good, Cleveland, a
Okay.
good friend of ours. We actually
Yeah.
got a picture of Nick Swisher. But if you actually, in the book, there's a picture of Nick Swisher pouring champagne over my dad's head in the World Series back in 2009. But anyway, Nick Swisher, if you want to meet Nick Swisher, say in December when the season is over, can you go to Walmart and meet him? Is he working there? Or is he working in McDonald's or any of the, could you meet him anywhere like that? No. Why isn't Nick Swisher working in the off season in McDonald's or Walmart? Why do you think? Right, he's making too much money. The guy makes millions of dollars even if he's not having a great season. Back then, that didn't happen. Back in 1951, players made, if they were lucky, $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. Joe DiMaggio, the greatest player in baseball, was making no more than $50,000, and he got a pay cut when he had a bad season. So they had to get jobs in the off season. The reason I bring all this up is because in New Jersey, close to where we grew up, there was a store called the American Shops, a clothing store, and the owner was very smart. He hired the World Series MVP to work in his store, to stand there, just like in Walmart, as a greeter. When you came in, he would say hello. The World Series MVP had to get an off-season job. So, Dad, pick it up from there if you would.
Right, the World Series MVP, and my mother and father read in the paper that the scooter, Phil Rizzuto, shortstop for the Yankees, would be there. So my mother said, well, maybe we'll bring him and you can meet Scooter, and we have the spirits a little bit. So we went in. My mother, I believe, spoke to him on the side before he came over to me, and then he came over, and my father said, oh my God, you won't believe it. This is Phil Rizzuto, the scooter. And he came over, he shook my hand, and he said, how you doing, son? I said, very good. He said, I understand you're a big baseball fan. I said, I love the game. Wonderful. He said, that's great. He said, you have any questions for me? So I started asking him all sorts of baseball questions. And he said, boy, you're really knowledgeable. He said, I'll tell you what. He said, you got to keep that spirit up. He said, I hope you're not down about anything, are you? I said, no, not right now. So he said, here's my phone number. So I'm going to give you my phone number. He said, and any time you want to talk, he said, baseball, or you're down about something, or whatever, or you just want to talk to me, no particular reason, just give me a call. He said, well, I guess I can't have your phone number because it's probably unlisted. I said, oh, no, I'll give you my phone number. So I gave him my phone number, and before I knew it, he called me up and he said, listen, now, what are you doing this afternoon? I said, nothing. He said, I'm going to come pick you up and take you for a ride. And that's how it all started. He took me for a ride and encouraged me all the time, talking about baseball and what would you like to do. And he said, the big thing is education. You have to get a good education. That's all the things he taught. Now, Scooter had 4 children, but yet he took me under his wing, and he encouraged me. Education, education. I went to a school for the blind for a couple of years. He came to visit me there just to make sure everything was okay. And then I went to the New York Institute for the Education of the Blind in the Bronx, New York. I was really happy to start doing things, and I started a club called the Diamond Dusters. And I had some ball players come up, Phil Rizzuto, Jackie Robinson, Mickey Mantle, Bobby Thompson. They all came to the high school, and I interviewed them. DeRocha invited me to the Polo Grounds in '52 and gave me a day there. And I was in his office. And I said to him, Mr. DeRocha, will I be able to go out on the field and meet some of the Giants? And he said to me, no, sir. My heart dropped. My mother was sitting out on the porch in the old Polo Grounds. Those of you that remember, there were no women around the clubhouse in those days. So she was sitting on the porch overlooking the field and seeing all the Giants, and I'm thinking to myself, I'll never get to meet them. He said, you can't go out in the field and meet them. But I'll tell you what, when they come in here, I'm going to have them come in my office. And if they don't come in here, they'll hear from me. I'll tell them off. And when they came in, they started marching in. Each one of them had a small bottle of Coca-Cola. By the time I met all the Giants, and there was more Coke on DeRocha's desk than ever before, I believe. But it was great. It was great talking to the ball players, and I interviewed them. I said, this is something I want to do. And then when I went to high school, that was my dream, starting my Diamond Dusters Club. I found out that blind people love baseball. And that's how I started, and Rizzuto encouraged me.
I'm gonna, if I can, I'm gonna read a passage from the book. It's another first meeting with a player, a name you'll all know, thanks to Mr. Rizzuto. So, and last night, if you're watching the All-Star game, they revealed for each team they had what they called the franchise four, kind of like, you know, the Mount Rushmore of baseball players. So this man definitely was on the list, and if he was alive, he always billed himself at Old Timers Day the greatest living ball player, and nobody disputed it until he passed away a few years ago. Joe DiMaggio was on baseball's Mount Olympus, right up there with Ruth, Gehrig, Cy Young, Ty Cobb, and other immortals of the game. He was bigger than life, and everyone wanted to be his pal. Mr. DiMaggio could also be very aloof. He guarded his privacy and his free time diligently. Very few people were allowed into his inner circle. Scooter was one of them. He and Mr. DiMaggio were roommates on the road and were inseparable while they played together, so Mr. Rizzuto had access to Jolt and Joe that almost nobody else did. I was, understandably, quite nervous when Mr. Rizzuto brought me into a private room at the stadium where Mr. DiMaggio and his good friends were gathered. It was like meeting the Pope. Phil told him a little bit about me and how the two of us had grown close in the last few years. To break the ice, Joe opened up with, "So, Eddie, nice to meet you. Tell me, what's your favorite Italian meal?" That threw me. I was expecting to talk baseball, not high cuisine with Joe DiMaggio. At a loss for words, I said the first thing that popped into my head, regretting it the instant it left my mouth. "Oh, let's see, every Tuesday my mom opens up a can or two of Chef Boyardee. I like that." I heard an audible groan from the men in the room, all of whom doted on Mr. DiMaggio and knew that as he was the firstborn American son of Italian immigrants, my answer was probably quite offensive to him. After what seemed like an eternity, the great man laughed, slapped me on the back, and said, "Somebody get this skinny Irish kid a bowl of pasta fagioli and fast." Joe then relaxed and started telling me tales of the glory days of the game. I was in. From that meeting on, Mr. DiMaggio treated me as a confidant. I had joined his exclusive club, and I wasn't even a bit Italian.
DiMaggio was wonderful to me. The other story was opening day, 1976. Yankees went to Shea Stadium for 2 years, 74 and 75, and the Yankee Stadium was renovated. Opening day, 76, new press box, new seats, and the media relations assistant came to me and said, "Listen, Ed, there's a seat next to you. Would you mind if Joe DiMaggio sat next to you during the game?" I said, "No, not at all. I'd be honored." Okay, because some people, they felt uncomfortable being around Mr. DiMaggio. So when he came in, he slapped my back and he said, "Hey, how you doing, Ed?" I said, "Fine." And I was going into my bag that I carry with me to get my earphones and radio. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm getting my earphones and radio to listen to the game, to see what's going on. Otherwise, I'm going to be lost." He said, "You put that away." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm going to be here, so I'm going to do play-by-play for you." I put it away, and he did play-by-play. Rudy May was pitching the first game in Yankee Stadium, the new Yankee Stadium, and Ford from Minnesota hit the first home run, and he called that, and he called the double plays, and he just was tremendous and wonderful, and told me what was going on, where they were positioned, and how they. I said, "You should go into broadcasting." He said, "I did. I didn't like it."
That's one of the other things about the book that we were happy to do, is to share stories about people that we all think we know them, and we think we know about them, and we know their public image, but the private people were completely different than what you saw in the public sometimes. And they're over and over and over again, these stories pop up in the book. And Mr. DiMaggio was one of them. You know, a lot of people say the guy was cold, he wasn't that, but I can tell you from growing up around the stadium, and my dad will tell you, obviously, and my older brother will, that he was a really nice guy, but he had one rule, and one rule only. If you wanted to break the friendship with Mr. DiMaggio and never ever have him talk to you again, there was one name you didn't say. Anybody know the name? Right, Marilyn Monroe.
Right.
He was married to Marilyn Monroe for a little over a year, and then they divorced, but he loved her to the day she died. And if you ever brought up her name, that was it. You could be his friend for 50 years, he would never talk to you again. So we never broke that rule. Just wanted to-
Yeah.
One of the other people, and we'll get to in the last chapter, it's amazing. Like I said, my father's got all these amazing stories. We couldn't fit all of them into the book. 80% of them didn't make the book, but one of the most amazing ones doesn't even come into the last chapter, so we'll get to it a little bit later. But it involves a man right here from Ohio, from Cleveland, a shipbuilder from Cleveland that came in and bought the Yankees in 1973, on my father's birthday, actually, January 3rd, 1973, and he swore. He said, I'm going to be a silent owner. I'm not going to say a word. You won't hear anything from me. Didn't work out too well, but thank goodness. George Steinbrenner, he's another guy. I will never say a bad thing about Mr. Steinbrenner because, first of all, as an owner, you want to win. You want your owner to put as much money into, people say the Yankees spend a lot of money, but he wanted to win. But the other thing is, people, if you ask, I'd say 90% of the population, tell me a little bit about George Steinbrenner, they're going to say mean guy, tyrant, the boss, iron fist and all that. That was the public image. Some of you, I don't know how many of you got to know him or know the Steinbrenner family or know stories about him. When he died around the same time, I think the anniversary was the other day, back in 2010, thankfully these stories were coming out. He was one of the most generous people you ever wanted to meet. Mr. Steinbrenner, I would regularly, as a little boy, watch him. He would pick up the New York City newspapers, the newspapers from our country, and he would see a story, said, a house burned down in the Bronx, 7 people lost their house, a whole family of 7, and he would say to his assistants, send them a check, whatever they need, 100,000, 200,000, buy them a new house, paper. But he didn't want his name anywhere near it. He would anonymously say, he had a saying, that is one of the greatest sayings, that if you do something good for somebody and more than 2 people know about it, you and the other person, you did it for the wrong reason. So he loved playing up that terrible image, but he was a really nice guy and a sweet guy. And I know we're skipping ahead to the end of the story, but Dad, you want to tell your favorite story about Mr. Steinbrenner, what he did for you?
Right, well, I met this wonderful woman, Allison, and I asked her, first of all, I was introduced to her by Phil Rizzuto because he went into the flower shop that her aunt worked in, and Allison had worked in the flower shop while she was going to college. She went to nursing school, and was working in the hospital, was a nurse. A few weeks after that, she was premature baby, and all of a sudden, she woke up one morning and had detached retinas. And that lost her sight for the most part. She has partial vision today. She can see peripherally. She cannot see anything straight ahead. So her aunt was very, very, very upset. Oh, my Allison, can't get a job, nobody will hire her. She's a nurse and can't work at that anymore. So Scooter said, listen, we'll introduce her to a friend of mine who's very successful. He said, how about if I have him call her? And I did. And we spoke on the phone for 6 years. The state of New Jersey would never give either one of us a driver's license to meet each other. But finally we met. And I asked her if she would like to be my bride. I said, would you like to be married at Yankee Stadium? She said, can we? I said, I don't know, but I requested. And I made a request, and I received a phone call from Rick Cerrone, not the ball player, but the media relations director of the Yankees at the time. He said to me, Ed, you made this request? I said, yes. He said, well, I want you to go see Gina. She's in charge of non-baseball events at Yankee Stadium. She wants to talk to you. I said, okay. So we went up there. So I had to meet you. She said, because I was told when I got this job, never, never, never allow anybody to be married at home plate. If you do, you're fired. She said, I got a memo from Mr. Steinbrenner. I called him right away. I said, listen, is this your handwriting? You sent this? You know what's going on here? Yes. He said, Ed is part of the family. And if he wants to be married at home plate, we're going to allow it. So she said, you got to pick out a menu because she's paying for the reception and everything that will go on here. So we had a nice reception in the Yankee Club. We picked out a menu. She said, now, the only thing is, you know, you gave me a check. I said, yes. She said, I don't want you to buy liquor. You'll pay for, you know, beer and wine, soda. Okay. So we did that. Gave her a down payment, gave her a check for the rest of the night, not knowing how much it was going to be. She said, 125 people can be invited. All right, so I had to pick out 125 closest friends. And so we were all ready, and the night before I get a phone call from the Yankees saying, listen, 6 more people are coming to your wedding. I said, I didn't invite anybody else. I said, I gave you a list. Oh, no, we know that. We got a call from Hollywood, California. Penny Marshall and her crew are coming. They would like to see your wedding and talk to you about a movie. So Penny Marshall showed up with her gang, and we had a wonderful day. It was 74 degrees on March the 10th, 2006. Mr. Steinbrenner had the field looking as if it was opening day, with the lines down, the bases, and the scoreboard operator put up a big sign, congratulations, Allison and Ed, on your wedding day. And we had a friend of mine who was the Phantom of the Opera at the time, and he came and he sang at the wedding. It was just wonderful. All my guests from one dugout to the other were around home plate, off the grass. No one was allowed on the grass except the bride and groom and their party. But they had everything there. And then we went upstairs to the reception. That I found out Mr. Steinbrenner that morning had someone call me and tell me, he's going to give you back your check. Right away I thought, oh my God, something happened. Did it bounce or whatever? And I said, no. Mr. Steinbrenner said, this is his gift to you. He couldn't be there, so he paid for the entire wedding. He had security there. He had grounds crew taking care of everything, the scoreboard operator, and then security throughout the stadium. It was in March, but he wanted to make sure that the guests didn't go into different offices and so forth, and he paid for the entire wedding, and that was a wonderful, wonderful gift. And he was always great to me, and anytime we saw him, he always went out of his way and said, do you need anything? I always told him, no, I don't need anything. What you gave me was great.
Yeah, people, and we talked about it in the book, that in the very beginning, and I kind of alluded to this before, when my father started his career, there was no such thing as a blind broadcaster. And you might say, well, how's a blind guy? We'll get to that in a little bit, because that's a question people ask all the time. But there was no such thing as that, and people thought it was impossible. And it wasn't easy in the beginning. It took a long time before finally players and media started accepting him, but Mr. Steinbrenner deserves the credit for that too, because he really set the tone when he bought the Yankees and met my father, who had predated him with the Yankees. I mean, my father had been there long before Steinbrenner got there. He said, it doesn't matter if you're disabled or not, you're capable, you're a wonderful writer, you're a wonderful broadcaster, you deserve to be here as much. And he gave my father, for the first time at any stadium, a seat with his name on it in the press box that, you know, only the writer's been around for a long time get that. He gave it to my father. It's actually 2 seats because he has a guide with him every game. And that was one of the things he did to signal to everybody else to say, look, this is a man. Another guy that did the same thing was the captain of the Yankees around that time, fellow guy from not too far away from here, from Canton, Ohio, Thurman Munson. Thurman Munson was one of the first players to really start treating my dad like a peer, just not looking at him as a blind guy reporter doing a job, just a regular reporter. And Thurman didn't like to talk to a lot of reporters, so he and my dad got along really well, and that told people around the league that he was, you know, someone just like anybody else. Just don't worry about any disability that he has. Don't look at him as a blind reporter. Just look at him as a reporter. So that was great. And getting back to the wedding, the other thing that was amazing, and my father said, it was March 10th. 2 days before, the Today Show was doing a profile on my dad for the wedding, and we went to Yankee Stadium to film a few things. There was snow on the ground. It had snowed, I think, the 2 days before that, so there was snow everywhere on the ground, freezing cold. And then suddenly we woke up that morning, 75 degrees, beautiful, sunny. So there were some Yankees upstairs watching. And at home plate, got to use the microphone, the same one that Lou Gehrig used, got to stand there. He mentioned the fellow from the Phantom of the Opera, but my brother and I both did passages, did readings there at that microphone and got to hear the whole today, considering the echo. And then he mentioned, what was it, 125 guests?
Right.
Double that amount of the media showed up that day because it was the one and only time anybody had ever been married at home plate. It was live on ESPN. It was carried on a bunch of other networks. And they had a press conference. And his wife, Allison, I love her. She's a blessing to the family. She gave one of the best answers in the press conference. Somebody said to him, why Yankee Stadium? She said, well, if you're going to give your bride a diamond, that's the biggest diamond you give. We'll get back to baseball in a bit, but I said my father's gone through so many amazing things that would have knocked ordinary people down. Allison is his second wife. His first wife was my mother, and my mother, when I was 2 and my brother was 4 years old, she walked out on us. She just left my father all by himself, walked away, and he had to raise my brother and me. I was 2, he was 4, had to raise all by himself for almost a decade, and then she came back almost a decade later and said, I want my kids back, and sued him for custody. And the courts just gave us back to her and said, well, a blind man shouldn't be raising children. That's not, there's no blind people can't do something like that. Even though he had been doing it for almost a decade, just gave us back. And he, obviously, again, was depressed at first, lost his children, but that never give up spirit that he had, he went out and got the best custody lawyer in the country and fought for 2 years, went all the way to the highest court, and he wound up winning, and he was the first disabled person in the history of the United States of America to win custody back from a non-disabled spouse, and also one of the first males to win, which is very rare as well in a custody battle to happen. So not just the baseball stuff, but the amount of barriers that he's broken and that he's gotten through is amazing. So I want to read another passage, if I can get through it. This one, it's my older brother. It's not me. My older brother, when he was younger, when my mother was still living with us, he begged my father one night, like any child would, to say, please, Daddy, read me a story. And he got out his book. He had this little Disney story book, and he said, read it to me. Handed it to my father. Well, my father could not read it. Even if he wanted to, just couldn't read it to him. Was frustrated, in tears, the fact that he could not read to his child. A rite of passage for every parent out there. That's one of the things you hopefully sit down and read to them. So it hurt him that he was not able to do it. And to add salt to the wound, my mother walked in at the time and said, he'll never be able to read to you. He's blind, he's useless, there's nothing he can do. Said to my brother, who I think was 3 or 4 at the time. So finally, my father find the page in it, found a company that made books for the blind. Actually, I'll just tell you the story instead of reading it. Found a company that made books for the blind in Tarzana, California, and they sent him Pinocchio, a book. And the books for the blind, on one side of the page was Braille, and the other side of the page was print. And it was a housewife, actually, wasn't even blind herself, named Jean Norris, back in the 1950s, heard a story similar to my father. She learned Braille and took it upon herself to sit there at home every night. She had her own kids, 3 of her kids of her own, but she took it to transcribe her Braille book so that blind parents could do what my father wanted to do. And he found this out, and by that time, by the 70s, her company had grown. She had volunteers helping her. They shipped them all over the country. So the first night the book arrived was Pinocchio. My father was able to sit down there on the bed next to my brother and read Pinocchio to him. So there were no more strings on my father at all. And in the book, he says he was in tears doing it. But it's one of those things that people take for granted. The fact that, these little things that everybody does, writes a passage and it's before, a little harder for my dad. But the question that I said we'd get to before is, how does a blind man broadcast a baseball game? People ask that all the time. Obviously, he doesn't do play-by-play. That wouldn't work out too well. But having the gift of being able to see before he went blind allows him to picture a ballpark. And that's one of the great things about the United States of America, that no matter who we are, baseball's in our DNA. Even if you think you hate the sport, we all know the sport, we all know the games. The phrases, home run, hit it out of the park, are part of American culture. So he had that advantage. But one of the unique things that he has, that people ask him all the time, is his ability to be able to, from the crack of the bat, hear how far, that he did it last night, and we were at the All-Star game, and he was able to call all the different plays, how far it's going and where it's going, the distance and the location. and you know, people ask, how can you explain it? But there was a Cleveland, and was a coach with the Cleveland Indians at the time?
Right?
Yes.
Bobby Bonds.
Bobby Bonds, and I'll let you pick up the story. Bobby Bonds loved this trick, but go ahead, you tell the story, Dad.
Bobby Bonds was a dear friend when he played for the San Francisco Giants. And then he came on to the Yankees, and we became friends. And his son, Barry Bonds, he was young, and he said to me, "Hey, Ed, listen, will you watch Barry for a minute? I got to go to the bathroom." I said, "Yeah, sure." I said, How am I going to watch him?" He said, "Just put him on your lap." So I had Barry Bonds on my lap, watching him until Bobby came back. But Bobby and I were dear friends. Anytime he came into New York, he would call me. We would get together and always get together on the ball field. And he was amazed that I could tell where the ball was being hit. If it was right field, left field, ground ball, whatever it may be. So he was coaching the Cleveland Indians at the time. And he called over this coach from the Indians and said, "Here, I want you to hit this." So he said, "Tell him where the ball was being hit." So I saw ground ball to short, fly ball to center, ground ball to first, and I would tell him all the places that the ball was being hit by these two batters that were in the cage. So he said, "Okay. Ed," he said, "there's other ball players getting in the cage now. I just want you to listen. Don't say anything. Don't tell me where the ball is being hit. Wait till this guy gets in the cage and starts hitting the ball." I said, "Okay. You just listen." I said, "Okay." So he finished, and he said to me, "Now tell me, is the batter black, white, or Hispanic?"
Now, one of the great things about growing up at Yankee Stadium, as I did with my dad, Yankee Stadium, more so I guess Dodger Stadium, probably the same thing, because it's right there in the entertainment capital, you just get everybody coming to the stadium. And my brother and I, because my father had to take care of us, we grew up there. The players were our babysitters, basically. We were in the clubhouse every night. And in the book, the phrase I use is, being with my father at Yankee Stadium was like being on the couch of the Tonight Show, because you never know, from game to game. We'd be driving over to the stadium after school, and I had just read about Richard Nixon and his presidency book, and then listening to Billy Joel in the car, and then we get to the stadium, and who we're having dinner with that night but President Nixon and Billy Joel. So it's kind of a surreal way to grow up, but one of my favorite stories was the man who taught my father how to play golf was a guy that was one of the co-owners of the Cleveland Indians. People don't realize this. For a long time, he loved baseball, lived to, I think, 100 years old, one of the greatest comedians of all time, Bob Hope. So one day my dad was at a charity tournament, and Bob Hope was at the tournament and said, "Ed, you want to come play golf?" And of course he said, "I don't play golf. I've never played." Bob Hope got him a set of left-handed golf clubs, took him out on the course, and showed him that day how to play golf. So my father learned it. But the best part about that was when he got back to Yankee Stadium a few nights later, one of his friends in the clubhouse asked him about that. You want to tell him the story, Dad?
Oh, yeah, they were asking me about that, and I mentioned, yeah, I got a set of golf clubs and, learning how to play. And Yogi said, "Really? You learning how to play?" He said, "Hey, Ed, how about we play together sometime?" I said, "Where would we play, Yogi?" He said, "Hey, listen, I have my own country club that we can go to, we can play anytime." He said, "Listen, you name the time, we have the place." I said, "Really?" He said, "When do you want to play?" I said, "How about Thursday night at midnight?" He said, "Thursday night at midnight, I won't be able to see." I said, "That'll make us even."
Yogi Berra. Can't top that. That's one, unfortunately, last night when they did the greatest living players, Yogi Berra was not on that list, but for anyone who knows baseball, Yogi Berra is 90 years old, just turned 90. Like anyone, 90 slowed down a bit, but he's still around and still as funny as ever, Yogi Berra. Still, he has these, that's another, he is, someone said, I don't know how true this is, one of those quotes, that he is the 5th most quoted American of all time, behind people like Mark Twain and Abraham Lincoln, because everybody knows, it ain't over till it's over. Nobody goes there anymore. It's too crowded. It gets late early out there. All these wonderful, I actually had my own yogiism a few years back. Yogi Berra's got if you're ever in New Jersey, there's an amazing museum, the Yogi Berra Museum. It rivals the Hall of Fame because the man won 10 World Series rings. He was in all these All-Star games, has all these trophies there, and it's kind of a history of the game of baseball. But we were at that museum, it was right after Phil Rizzuto passed away, so 2007 or so, and we were all sitting in the back room. They had a luncheon. I'm sitting at the table with Mr. Berra, And it was ramping up, just like we are right now, for the presidential election the next year. And everybody was throwing their hat into the ring like we have today, all these different contenders. So somebody asked Yogi, all these people are coming to you. Who are you going to throw your vote to? And he said, well, I got that new guy, Obama. He asked me to be on his side. I got Hillary Clinton asking me. He said, we got John McCain, all these different people. And somebody said, what about Romney? He said, oh, that guy. We said, what's wrong with Romney? He said, he asked me to endorse him, but there's no way I could do that. They said, why wouldn't you do that? Do you have something against him? He said, no, nothing personal. But he said, I'm a catcher. How can I endorse a guy named Mitt? And everybody started laughing like you were, and he said, what's so funny? He had no idea that he was, so that's Yogi Berra. He doesn't, his famous quote is, half the things I said I didn't say.
Right. One of the things that he's telling the Yogi story, I have to tell you this story. We were standing on the field one day, and the press, about 5 or 6 of us, and talking about Greg Harris, who was a pitcher for the Texas Rangers at the time, and he could throw both left-handed and right-handed, but he couldn't get the ball over left-handed consistently. But he was, ambidextrous, and we were talking about him, how he tried to do it several times, and today the Oakland A's have the former Yankee farmhand as a ambidextrous pitcher. So we were talking about it, and Yogi came over, tapped me on the shoulder, hey, Ed, what's going on? What are you guys laughing about, talking about? I said, Yogi, we're talking about Harris, who's the ambidextrous pitcher for the Texas Rangers. Oh, yeah, he said. He put his arm around me. He said, I get my right arm to be ambidextrous.
We can go all night with Yogi stories. If I put all the Yogi stories in the book, it would have been chapters long. Before we finish up, I do want to read one last passage from the book. It's my favorite passage from the entire book, and it's obviously involves my father, but it shows a different side of somebody, like I said before, that we think we all know, but it's a more human side, it's a more touching side. So I have to give you a little backstory. I don't know if my father mentioned, there was a fellow named Jackie Farrell who was, he billed himself as the vice president in charge of getting kids to meet Yogi Berra, because he worked for the Yankees, and whenever somebody like my grandmother would write a letter, he would make sure that the arrangements were made. So he got to know my father very well, really helped my father out just as much as Mr. Steinbrenner and other people. So he's in the story, I want to explain who he is. And also, my dad went to a camp for blind children in New Jersey, and one of his fellow campers, one of his best buddies actually, was not only blind, he was also deaf and mute, like Helen Keller. And he'd gone to the Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts, the same one that Helen Keller went to. So he communicated, his name was Eddie, in the same way that Helen Keller did, with people writing in his hand. And, Braille was not what, you would have to physically write the letters and write the words. Time consuming, but I give you all that because that's part of the story. In August 1954, Jackie Farrell helped me to arrange a special moment for a friend, my best buddy from Camp Marcella, Eddie Reese. I explained to Jackie that Eddie was blind, deaf, and mute, and that he was a huge Yankee fan, even though he'd never actually been to Yankee Stadium. Eddie's favorite player was Mickey Mantle. He told me once that it was his dream to be able to meet Mantle in person. As soon as I mentioned that to Jackie, he said, pick a day. I arranged for a pass from camp for Eddie and me. One of the counselors drove us down to Yankee Stadium. Mr. Farrell met us and took us right down to the tunnel underneath the ballpark that stretched between the dugout and the clubhouse. We waited for Mickey, who was taking batting practice, to finish his daily reps. Mantle had inherited center field from Joe DiMaggio in 1952 and was the new face of the Yankees. With his boyish charm, his blonde hair, his chiseled features, and God-given gift to hit baseballs a country mile, he was a natural matinee idol. Soon we heard the click, click, click of hard metal spikes on the concrete surface of the runway. They had an odd cadence compared to the other times I'd heard the same sound from other players. The rhythm was almost a half step off. I realized that it must be Mickey. The accident he suffered in the 1951 World Series made him walk with a slight limp and a crooked gait for the rest of his life. Mantle was complaining about being tired and sore when he got to where we were standing, but still took a moment to say hello. I'd met Mickey a few times before, so he was familiar with me. Mr. Farrell pointed out Eddie Reese to Mickey as I wrote, "Mickey's here," in my friend's palm. Mantle was fascinated with this method of communication, and when I told him that he was Eddie's favorite player, he asked how Eddie was able to follow the games if he couldn't see or hear. I showed Mickey how I described the play-by-play in Eddie's hands. The Yankees superstar walked over to Eddie, shook his hand, and said in that famously slow Oklahoma drawl of his, "Nice to meet you. Thanks for being a fan." Of course, Eddie had no way of hearing this, so I quickly translated to Eddie what Mantle had said to him. In return, Eddie spelled out something for me in my hand. "What's he writing to you now?" said Mickey. It took me a moment to say the words out loud. I had to be sure that I was getting the message correct. Eddie's request was an unusual one. He told me to ask Mickey if it was okay to feel his muscles. Mantle didn't hesitate. He pulled Eddie toward him and he flexed his biceps a bit so that my friend could touch and experience up close the powerful arms, shoulders, and chest that had won over so many admirers and helped to propel baseballs far over the fence. This wasn't vanity on Mantle's part, just a quiet moment between a devoted fan and a player far away from any cameras or spotlights. Eddie turned back to me and grabbed my hand, excitedly writing the same thing over and over again in my hand. "What's he saying now?" Mickey asked. "Just one word," I replied. "Your name, over and over again." He's chanting, "Mickey, Mickey, Mickey." With that, Mantle abruptly said, I gotta go, guys. It was nice meeting you," and hurried off. I was confused by the rush until Jackie Farrell told me later what had actually happened. The young slugger was so moved by the excitement on Eddie's face that he could barely compose himself emotionally enough to stay in that spot and continue chatting. Eddie's visit and the subsequent reaction to it had touched him so much that Mickey Mantle, hero to millions, was sitting alone in the corner of the Yankee clubhouse, reduced to uncontrollable sobs. Well, again, you see, that's it's one of my favorite stories because it just shows the side of baseball that you hardly ever hear in the media, in the press, and I say that shows it's indicative of the type of book that this is, where it's not just stories. You know, a lot of people said to my father, "Hey, if you want to sell more books, you got to dig up dirt and tell tales out of school and give all the..." And we didn't want to do that. We chose to write a book that was a positive book and give a positive message. So to finish up, I will turn it over to my father if you have any words of advice or encouragement to the folks.
Well, as I tell everyone when I go out speaking and doing sessions like this, never give up. I had my family, faith, and friends who were there for me, not only as a child, but growing up and even today. You don't give up. Reach for the stars. And whatever you can do, just have the greatest feeling of doing it. And I'm sure most of the time you'll be able to achieve it.
Oh, thank you all very much.
I think there's any questions? Thank you.
Folks, I need to tell you some things. These people came here free tonight. They drove from Cincinnati from the All-Star game to here, and they're going from here to New Jersey. That's very unusual for speakers and books of this caliber. That's one thing. The second thing is that we have a wonderful exhibit of antique baseball equipment, both in these cases and in the vignette room out in the front lobby. Thanks to a gentleman in the back of the room. Paul, please at least take your hat off and wave it.
Thank you, Paul.
From town collects antique baseball equipment. Third, I made a phone call after I read his book because I never knew of the National Beat Baseball circuit at all. Okay. And I learned so much about beat baseball, which is baseball for the blind. And when I called and found out that there was a local Cleveland team, they graciously came and brought literature, brought the equipment that they use when they play baseball. They have a World Series all themselves, and I understand there are 24 national teams. And they brought some things in the back of the room, the ball, the signals. You can look at that. Fourth, there's the Learned Owl in the very back of the room selling the books for Mr. and Mr. Lucas, and they will be happy to sign. They're going to sit in the middle table in the back and sign. Wait, fifth, somebody in here got in trouble, actually is in trouble when I find them. When you were registered, I thought it was very interesting, under special requests, somebody wrote they wanted box seats and a cold beer. And I can't make beer happen in this building because it's a public building. However, thanks to their request and thanks to the popcorn, I can't believe it's the popcorn store in town, I can never remember the name of it, they provided free popcorn for us. So Joe, if you would open the kitchen window, you'll see there's popcorn and water for all of you baseball fans. And the National Baseball, big baseball people are in the back of the room. So make sure you patronize our favorite popcorn store. And last, wait, one more thing, Frank. I understand you gentlemen might like Ohio a little after your drive.
Yes.
Well, we wanted to thank you in an official way. So these are gifts for you from Ohio, and they are all Ohio made.
Thank you very much.
In here is Ohio maple syrup that I made. There are mugs from the Hudson Library and Historical Society which cannot be bought, they can only be given. And finally, I understand you might have a thing for Chef Boyardee, which is an Ohio product.
I did not know that.
So you each get gifts. I'll set those there. I think Mr. Youngworth of Good Day in Hudson has something to tell us.
Yeah, I just want, when you mentioned about the Lerner and All Bookshop being here, I've been a lifelong baseball fan. I've been a lifelong believer of interesting, enthusiastic stories, and I'm a Christian. And all three, the most inspirational book I think I ever read was the book that our friend Ed Lucas wrote. I wholeheartedly recommend it to everybody here, anybody who loves baseball, who loves to read stories that'll bring tears to your eyes. A beautiful, beautiful book, so I highly recommend it.
Don't forget to get some popcorn and some water. See the Beat Baseball folks, and you can purchase and talk to them in the back of the room.
Is there any questions beforehand?
Well, we're going to take them in the back of the room.
Okay, very good.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I understand there's a movie.
Yeah, sorry. Good, we did allude to, he mentioned Penny Marshall, who called the Yankees and said, there's a wedding, I want to be at the wedding. And Penny Marshall was there, and then flew us out to her house in California. This is back in 2006, but like everything with Hollywood, it just takes forever for movies to be made. So the script was written by Lowell Ganz and Bob Lou Mandel, who created Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, Mork and Mindy. They wrote A League of Their Own, Fever Pitch, Splash, all these, Parenthood. They created that, all these great shows and movies. So the script has been around for a while, and it's been in development. The book is accelerating it. We're the co-producers of the movie, so legally I'm not allowed to tell you until he actually signs on the dotted line. But a major Hollywood star has taken the book, read it, and really, really wants to play my dad. Because if you want to win an Oscar, there are 3 secrets to winning an Oscar. You either play somebody who's disabled, or you play somebody who's had their children taken away from them and fighting for the children back, or you play somebody who's trying to overcome some sort of obstacle. Well, this has all 3 in one. So I cannot give you the name of the person until he signs on the dotted line, but it rhymes with Radley Looper. You didn't hear it from me. I didn't say. So hopefully 2016, 2017, we'll be back when the movie comes out. We'll do a presentation for the movie. Yes, sir. Yes.
Do you have audio?
Yes, there is an audio book as well. I know that it can be, it's downloadable through, is it Audible, and libraries can also order the, but I narrated with my father the audio book. So just as I read passages here, it's a whole 8 hours of me reading passages from the book, all straight through.
We're going to send him to the back of the room now. Thank you all.
to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the adult program series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.